I don't think he knows the first thing about the Second World War. Probably the only thing he sees is from the movies from Hollywood. Or, maybe John Wayne won the war or Clint Eastwood or something like that.
Hello, I am Michael Anderson, and this is the podcast from two grumpy old men on Ukraine. The voice you just heard belongs to Professor David Marples, a historian at the University of Alberta in Canada. David is an authority on Belarus, Russia and Ukraine, both when it comes to the present situation, but also historically the 1930s and 40s. I thought this week I would bring on a man who actually knows history as a balance to the US president, who this week has been issuing his very own interpretations of history. On May the 8th, the West celebrates and commemorates VE Day, that the Allies that day in 1945 forced Nazi Germany to surrender and thereby ended World War II in Europe. But Donald Trump now wants the US to drop the E in the VE, and he wants to rename the day Victory Day for World War II. In social media post published very late at night, Trump said that, quote, many of our allies and friends are celebrating May 8th as Victory Day, but we did more than any other country by far in producing a victorious result in the Second World War. We, meaning the US, won both wars, the First and the Second World War. Nobody was close to us in terms of strength, bravery and brilliance. You can almost hear Trump sitting there in the bed next to Melania late at night, reading his post aloud to himself, beating his chest. Trump also declared that he wants a huge military parade on June 14th to celebrate the 250-year anniversary of the US Army. That parade will cost between $60 and $80 million. It is of course a total coincidence that the 14th of June also happens to be Donald Trump's own birthday. Many in Europe, and not least in the former Soviet Union, are strongly critical of Trump's outbursts about the US doing more than anybody and the US winning both world wars, calling them disrespectful. I've talked to many historians this week, and most agree that Trump certainly has a point on the money and equipment side. The Lend-Lease agreement with the UK and the Soviet Union, without that Hitler might well have beaten us, many say. But what pretty much everybody also agrees on, and many are rather angry about, is Trump's total disregard, and not for the first time, for the people of the former Soviet Union. President Trump, as we know, is not that much into facts. But the facts, for example as they are put forward by the US National World War II Museum, are that 27 million people from the Soviet Union, as it was, died in the war, while about 418,000 Americans lost their lives, half in the war in Europe and half in the war in the Pacific. Again, here is a man who actually does know history professor David Marples.
About 27 million residents of the Soviet Union died in that war. I mean, there's no comparison at all in terms of losses.
It may be brutal and even crude to point out, but these numbers mean that for every American who died in the Second World War, 65 people from the Soviet Union died. Or to put it in another way, in the US the war killed 1 out of each 330 people. In the Soviet Union the war killed 1 out of each 6 people. In Western societies, World War II plays a role in our education, public life, cultural life, films, public conversations, if you will. But this is nothing compared to the place the Second World War still has in the former Soviet Union. So I started by asking David Marples to explain the importance of the Second World War in countries like Ukraine, Belarus and Russia.
Yeah, and I think I would divide them up between Russia and Belarus on the one hand and Ukraine on the other, because I think they look at it very differently. Russia and Belarus inherited this sort of Soviet legacy about the World War II, which really started in the 1960s, around 1965, on the 20th anniversary. And I think that both Putin and Lukashenko, longtime dictators, tried to use the war as a form of identity building. They've used it deliberately to justify their own presidencies, which we could look on as illegitimate by Western standards, at least, in that they fabricate elections. They get elected by manipulating the election commissions, the candidates, whatever, and then they stay there indefinitely. And yet they seem to have lost a bit of influence, particularly Lukashenko in 2020, when quite clearly the entire population wanted to be rid of him, but didn't resort to force to do it. On the other hand, Ukraine, I think, has had a lot of dilemmas about the Second World War. I mean, sure, they contributed about 20% of the Red Army, which is an enormous figure. They also suffered most of the occupation along with Belarus. They were occupied for about 3 years. And therefore, they remember that war, I think, with some ambivalence, because today they also revere the people who were fighting against the Red Army in the Western regions, particularly the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which continued into the late 1940s and even early 50s. So today, I think, the Ukrainian memory of that war is also tinged with anger over the current war, over the Russian intrusions into Ukraine, over the bigger invasion from 2022. And therefore, they don't celebrate the same things. Ukraine very definitely has adopted the European standard. We will celebrate May the 8th as the liberation of Europe from the Nazis, not May the 9th, when the Soviets celebrate their own. But in terms of the way the war developed in the Soviet Union, they carried most of the burden, I would say, for the Allies for the first part of the war. I mean, if you separate like they separate the 1939-41 period under the Nazi-Soviet pact, where the Soviet Union was actually part of the invading force, invading Poland along with the Nazis. They separate that and they start from 1941 in what they call the Great Patriotic War. And by focusing on that, they just simply look at the German-Soviet war, that the Soviets were the main ones fighting off the German attack and incurring simply enormous losses. And, after you phoned, I looked up the American total casualties in the Second World War, just over 1 million, which, in the Battle for Moscow, the Soviets lost more than that, let alone the entire war. And about 27 million residents of the Soviet Union died in that war. And that's a conservative estimate. I've seen figures that are actually higher than that, because the civilian population can be included as well. You really cannot compare. I mean, there's no comparison at all in terms of losses. But also, I think, in terms of the fighting the Nazis and taking up Nazi strength, roughly 75% of that was taken up by the Soviet army, the Red Army. And the Americans, the British, Canadians, and others who came into Western Europe only came in June 1944. That was when they invaded, the D-Day invasions. I don't think you can really compare.
I mean, the Western Front was sort of much, much smaller than the Eastern Front, which was absolutely enormous, going all the way from the Baltic Sea down to the Black Sea and beyond. I mean, I'm sure you've had the same experience when you travel around the former Soviet Union, that I'm not sure I know a family that doesn't have grandfather and grandmother's war stories. And I've met, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of people who have been involved themselves. I mean, my God, I lived in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, and I think the Uzbek losses in the Second World War were the equivalent of the American losses. I mean,
yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, that's amazing for when you think about it. So overall, when you hear Mr. Trump saying, and this is the direct quote from his social media post, "We," meaning United States of America, "did more than any other country by far to produce the victory in World War II." Can we agree that's not exactly true?
No, I mean, if he'd added to that in the Pacific zone, it might have some validity, because the Americans did bear the brunt of the war in that zone, fighting the Japanese. No question about that. But the losses, again, were very small compared to the Soviet losses on the western part of the war. And I believe he also mentioned the First World War, where the Americans didn't come in until a year from the end of that war, or more or less a year from the end, perhaps even less than that. By the time the American troops got to Europe, it was like April 1945. April 1918. I'm confusing the two there. April 1918. Yes, they turned the tide of that war, but for the most part, the Americans weren't even in that war. So, that's simply nonsense. The Second World War, I would say, yes, maybe in the Pacific, naval war in particular, but not in the European war.
The thing is that nobody wants to sit and say, oh, 2 million people from your country died, but 3 million from my country. That's not really dignified. But I do want to point out that the differences, the discrepancies between the losses, the human losses in the former Soviet Union, and for example in America, are staggering difference. But I think one thing that's more important that Mr. Trump seems to not understand, because I think he also looks at, of course, and he also mentioned that the money, the Lend-Lease agreements, the equipment, which is absolutely valid. And I've talked to many people today who say, on the one hand, it is true, without American money and without the Lend-Lease agreements and the equipment, we would have been in big trouble. We might have lost. But the thing is, 70, 80 years later, nobody, beats their chest and say, oh, we helped you with equipment, we helped you with money. That doesn't really weigh very much compared to, both my grandparents, all my grandparents perished in this war, does it? I mean, in sort of a nation's memory.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely true. There is a qualifier, I think, and that is the way the Soviet army fought the war, which was really pretty much the same as it's doing in the Donbass today. It's like a head-on assault, full frontal assault, war of attrition, where you may lose the troops in like the first 5 or 6 waves, but the seventh one will get through. And that was always Zhukov's type of warfare, that you would simply overwhelm the enemy with superior forces eventually. So as much as the Nazis dug in, they would eventually be moved. And that way, the Soviet losses are always going to be high, from these kind of tactics. And I think it's the same in Ukraine today. They're losing a lot of troops, hundreds of thousands of troops, by this type of warfare. But, that's a different issue altogether, probably, than, the memory of the war, because as you say, everybody remembers somebody. And interestingly, in 2020, when there were the mass uprisings in Belarus, the demonstrators were comparing the security forces with the Nazis and themselves with the partisans. They said, we are the partisans. So even the current generation, these are people sort of 20, 25, 30 perhaps, even the current generation, it's deeply ingrained in their psyche, right? That this is how they look on the war.
There's been a lot of angry messages coming back to me saying, who does this Trump guy think he is? He's just using this and things that I can't, repeat on a nice podcast like this. Which leads me to the question of, why do you think he's doing this? I mean, is he really that badly educated that he doesn't know the importance of the war, how people feel about it? Doesn't he care? Doesn't he know what? I know it's a difficult question, but it seems so staggering, so that a president would put this out.
Don't forget that when he was talking about the War of Independence, he said that Paul Revere was riding so fast because he had to get to the airport. Do you remember that one?
Yeah.
I mean, this is a guy with staggering ignorance. I don't think he knows the first thing about the Second World War. I mean, probably the only thing he sees is from the movies, from Hollywood. And this is his interpretation of the war. Maybe JohnWayne won the war, or Clint Eastwood, or something like that. But it's very far from the reality. I think he sees, someone like Putin celebrating this 80 years, as something almost contemporary, that it matters to them today. Whereas we look at it as something so far distant, that we can't even, my parents were too young to take part in the Second World War. So even they, had a sort of vague idea about the war, and they didn't talk about it all that much when I was growing up.
I've always remembered this historian who showed me that 100,000 bridges over rivers had been ruined. I mean, somehow that just shows me, it's always been with me, that this number of the destruction. I've talked to people who basically said, I went to the front, and when I came home, there was nobody left in my village. I mean, literally not one single person. I mean, these things are unimaginable.
It's unimaginable. And when you think 3.3 million Wehrmacht troops invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, and even today, that number is kind of unimaginable. To sort of focus that much on the Eastern Front was unprecedented. They'd never seen an invasion like this. And I think also another thing to consider is the way Nazis treated their prisoners. The prisoners from Western Europe were treated fairly benignly, or at least according to, I forget the convention now, I think it's Geneva Convention or Vienna. Yeah. Since the Soviets had never signed that, and since they were regarded as sort of inferior people, they were mostly starved to death. I mean, you see hundreds of thousands of people just dying in these camps, when on the other side of the wire, there were Western European prisoners. There are movies made about Western Europeans escaping from these camps over and over again. You never saw any movies about people from the Red Army escaping from these camps.
You mean simply in the same camp?
Yes, I've seen photographs of prisoners from, forget where they were from now, Britain or United States or wherever, but they were being taken into a camp, and on the other side of the wire were the Soviet prisoners, looking half-starved and emaciated. So this is another factor, right? These are all different factors to take into account of the way the Nazis treated people on the Eastern Front. This was a racial war. I mean, it was a war of extermination.